There is a photograph that circulates quietly on the internet, one that most people scroll past without stopping. In it, a man sits in a chair that was clearly not meant to hold someone so still, so heavy with something invisible. His eyes carry the particular exhaustion of a person who has been performing for so long that they have forgotten what their real face looks like. Behind those eyes, there is a story the world does not fully know. A secret that was hidden not out of shame, exactly, but out of something more complicated. A fierce and almost spiritual need to control the one thing that fame had not yet taken from him. What happens to a man who once set the entire world on fire, who played gods and killers and legends, when the world stops looking? And what happens when the thing slowly killing him is not what anyone suspected? What if the version of Val Kilmer the world grieved was never quite the real one to begin with? He was born on December 31st, 1959, and there is something almost too poetic about that date, the last day of the year, the exhale before the world begins again. New Year's Eve, a threshold day, a day built for endings and beginnings pressed up against each other, so tightly you cannot tell where one stops and the other starts. He came into the world in Los Angeles, California, in a family that looked, from the outside, like one of those sun-bleached California dreams. Warm air, wide boulevards, a mother named Gladys who believed in the extraordinary, a father named Eugene who worked in real estate and aerospace. They lived in the San Fernando Valley, and if you have never been to that part of Los Angeles in the late 1960s, you should know that it was a place that felt both enormous and enclosed, a valley literally ringed by mountains, a world unto itself, and for a boy like Val Kilmer, it was both a stage and a cage. He was the middle child, wedged between two brothers, Mark and Wesley. Middle children learn things the other positions in a family never quite do. They learn to read rooms. They learn to become whatever the moment needs. They learn to perform. Val Kilmer began performing not because someone told him to, but because it was the language through which he best understood himself. He was sharp in ways that made adults uncomfortable. He tested into a school that recognized that sharpness, and somewhere along the way he discovered that acting was not pretending, not really. It was the only mode in which a feeling too large for ordinary conversation could be handed to another human being intact. He went to the Juilliard School in New York, the youngest student ever admitted to the drama division at that time. Think about what that means for a moment. A boy from the San Fernando Valley, barely 17 years old, walking into one of the most rigorous acting institutions in the world and being told, essentially, that he belonged there more than almost anyone. The city of New York in the late 1970s was dangerous and electric and filthy and alive in ways that would shape him permanently. He was not just learning technique at Juilliard. He was learning what it cost to be fully present in a human body, in front of other human beings, without flinching. But even as all of that brightness was gathering, something dark was already forming at the edges. In 1977, when Val was still a teenager finding his footing in New York, his younger brother Wesley died. He drowned in a jacuzzi, a seizure taking him without warning, without the courtesy of preparation or goodbye. Wesley was 16 years old. There are losses that announce themselves, that give you time to brace. And then there are losses like this one, sudden, senseless, the kind that leaves a particular shape of hole in a person that never quite fills in. Val Kilmer has spoken about Wesley over the years in interviews, always carefully, always with the tone of someone handling something that is still, even decades later, warm to the touch. Wesley had epilepsy. The seizure was not a complete surprise to the family in terms of the medical reality, but death always manages to be a surprise anyway. Val was in New York when it happened, beginning the life that his talent demanded, and Wesley died in California, and that distance, physical, existential, is something that never fully leaves a person. The desert between those two facts. The way a brother can be alive and then, between one phone call and the next, not be. This loss became, in many ways, the engine of everything that followed. Not in a simple cause and effect way, not in a way that a therapist could diagram cleanly. But grief has a way of pushing certain people toward transcendence, toward the need to make something that lasts. Val Kilmer turned toward Christian Science, the faith his family practiced, which holds that the material world is less real than the spiritual one, that the body's troubles can be addressed through prayer and spiritual understanding. This was not a casual religious affiliation for Kilmer. It was, and remains, something closer to his operating system, the framework through which he interprets reality, including suffering, including his own body, including the crisis that would arrive decades later and nearly finish him entirely. After Juilliard, after New York, after Wesley, Val Kilmer came back to California carrying a grief he had not yet named and a talent so outsized it barely fit inside an ordinary room. He did theater. He worked. He built. And then, in 1984, he appeared in a film called Top Secret, a comedy that was too strange and too smart to be a conventional hit, but that made clear to anyone paying attention that this young man had something the camera could not stop chasing. He was funny in ways that required intelligence to appreciate, and he was physically magnetic in ways that required nothing at all. He was, from his very first moments on screen, completely at home in a way that most actors spend entire careers trying to fake. But the real moment, the one that would change everything and set his life spinning in a direction no one could have predicted, came 2 years later. 1986, a film about fighter pilots and love in American mythology that would become one of the defining cultural artifacts of its decade. Top Gun. He played Lieutenant Tom Iceman Kazansky, and the name felt like a prophecy, or maybe a joke, because Val Kilmer was anything but icy in real life. He was volcanic. Iceman was cool where Kilmer was fire, controlled where Kilmer was excess, methodical where Kilmer was instinct. And that contrast between the man and the role was part of what made the performance crackle. When he told Tom Cruise's Maverick, with that slow, contemptuous smile, that he was dangerous, the entire audience believed him. Not because Kilmer was being menacing, but because Kilmer was being true, and truth, in the hands of a real actor, always registers as danger. Top Gun was a phenomenon. It made over $350 million at the box office worldwide. It made Tom Cruise into a superstar, yes, but it also made Val Kilmer into something harder to define and perhaps more interesting. The second sun in a solar system everyone thought only had one. He was the film's antagonist who you couldn't quite root against, the competitor you respected more than you were supposed to, the cool blue flame burning on the other side of the frame. And he knew it. He absolutely knew it. There is a particular kind of confidence that takes root in a young man when the world confirms what he has secretly believed about himself, and it can be the most beautiful thing in the world to watch, and the most dangerous thing in the world to carry. The years that followed were extraordinary and turbulent in equal measure. He played the most iconic role in the Batman franchise up to that point, when he donned the cowl in 1995's Batman Forever. He played the doomed, brilliant, hilarious Doc Holliday in Tombstone in 1993, a performance so precise and so alive that people still quote it in the 21st century with the reverence usually reserved for scripture. I'm your Huckleberry. For words that somehow contain an entire philosophy, an entire personality, an entire way of facing death with a grin and a glass of whiskey. It is the performance that many actors would trade their entire careers for, and Kilmer delivered it almost as a side note. In a supporting role, while chewing every scene, he entered and somehow making everyone else more interesting in the process. And yet the reputation was forming alongside the legend. The word on Kilmer on Hollywood sets was that he was difficult, that he was demanding, that he pushed directors, that he took up too much space in the room, too much oxygen, too much conversation. By the time he arrived on the set of The Island of Dr. Moreau in 1996, the stories had calcified into mythology. Director John Frankenheimer reportedly said that the two worst experiences of his career were the making of that film and working with Marlon Brando, and Val Kilmer was both on the same film. Kilmer, for his part, was never one to apologize for his standards. He believed in a version of acting that was total, immersive, sometimes consuming. Whether that was visionary or exhausting probably depended on where you were standing. But here is the thing about the stories of difficult behavior, the thing that rarely makes it into the articles and the retrospectives. A man who grieves in a way he never fully processed, who carries a dead brother in his chest, who has built his entire sense of self around a craft that the industry treats as a product, will sometimes behave in ways that are hard to understand from the outside. The difficult behavior and the grief and the faith and the talent were not separate things in Val Kilmer's life. They were the same thing, expressed in different registers. By the early 2000s, the big roles were coming less frequently. The industry is a strange and merciless weather system, and the currents had shifted. He worked. He made independent films. He did theater. He traveled. He had been married to the British actress Joanne Whalley from 1988 to 1996, and they had 2 children together, Jack and Mercedes, who were by all accounts the fixed stars of his interior life, the things that hold still when everything else moves. The divorce was painful, as divorces are, and the distance that came with it, partial custody, different coasts, the particular loneliness of being a father in installments, added another layer to a life that was already carrying considerable weight. And then came the moment that would reorganize everything. In 2015, Val Kilmer went to a doctor and heard words that very few people knew about for quite some time. He had a tumor in his throat. He had throat cancer. The treatment that followed was brutal in the ways that cancer treatment is always brutal. The radiation, the surgeries, the slow erosion of certain things that had been central to his identity, including the voice that had shaped so many iconic performances, the voice that had made Iceman's contempt land like a fist and Doc Holliday's humor bloom like a dark flower. He had a tracheotomy. He breathed through a tube. He could no longer speak in the way he once had. Here is where the faith becomes not a background detail, but a foreground fact. Val Kilmer did not announce his cancer. He did not give interviews. He did not post on social media with the language of the warrior, the fighter, the survivor, all those military metaphors we reach for when facing illness because we do not have better ones. He turned inward. He prayed. He leaned on Christian Science's belief that the body's experience is not the ultimate reality, that spirit is primary, that healing is possible through alignment with a higher truth. When he eventually did speak about his illness publicly, after a 2017 Facebook post in which Michael Douglas mentioned Kilmer's cancer, and Kilmer felt his privacy had been taken from him before he was ready, there was a particular kind of measured anger in his response. He had wanted to control this. He had wanted to hold this in his own hands, on his own terms, in his own time. In 2021, the documentary Val was released, and it changed everything for the people who watched it. For decades, Kilmer had been filming himself, on sets, at home, with his children, in his most private moments. Hours and hours of footage, a personal archive of a life lived in full color. And when his son Jack helped him assemble that footage into a film, what emerged was something unlike any celebrity documentary anyone had seen. It was not a redemption narrative. It was not a PR exercise. It was a man, sitting with the actual texture of a life. The joy and the grief and the ambition and the loss and the love and the scar on his throat and the breathing tube and the voice that now sounds like it is coming from somewhere deeper than the body, from somewhere further in. He said, in the film, that he is the luckiest man alive. And you could hear, under those synthesized words spoken through a device, the absolute sincerity of someone who has looked at the bottom of the well and decided, with full information, that the light above is real. The love in his life has always been complicated and layered. The marriage to Joanne Whalley, the mother of his children, was a chapter that closed but left the most important things behind. His children, Jack and Mercedes, who have grown into remarkable people, who cared for him during his illness with a devotion that is itself a kind of testimony. There was Cher, the relationship in the 1980s that the tabloids loved and that Kilmer has spoken about with real warmth, something genuine between two people who were both, in their different ways, larger than life. He has spoken about longing for connection, for intimacy, for someone to sit with in the quiet. The illness changed the logistics of human connection in ways that are intimate and painful and almost impossible to put into language, but he has tried. He has always tried to put things into language. What he stands for now, at this point in his life, is something that took the full weight of everything to arrive at. He is an artist in the oldest sense of the word, someone for whom making things is not a career choice, but a metabolic necessity. He paints. He writes. He creates. He has published a book of poetry and prose, has held exhibitions of his visual art, has continued performing in whatever ways his body currently allows. The theater of his life has not closed. It has simply moved to a different venue with different acoustics, and a performer who has learned that silence can be as expressive as any line. The tracheotomy tube, the voice box, the breathing hole in the throat that he covers with his hand when he speaks so that air can be redirected. These have become, in a strange way, the symbolic objects of his late life, the visible evidence of an invisible war that he fought largely alone. They are the thing that the camera cannot look away from, and neither can you, and the reason is not pity. The reason is that they tell the truth in a way that a perfect, unaltered body simply cannot. They say, this man was tested at the deepest level, in the instrument of his craft, in the voice that was his primary tool for 30 years, and he is still here, still making, still speaking, even if the speech now requires a finger pressed to a tube in his throat. Now, it is time to speak directly to you. You, who came to this video perhaps because you remember a specific film, a specific line, a specific moment when Val Kilmer did something on screen that made you feel something you did not expect to feel. Or maybe you came because you heard he was sick and you wanted to understand. Or maybe you are here because you are facing something in your own life that is making you question whether the story you are in has a good enough ending. Whatever brought you here, I want you to stay with this for just another moment. There is a version of Val Kilmer that the industry decided on, that the tabloids printed, that the think pieces constructed, the difficult genius, the faded star, the cautionary tale about ego and excess. That version is not entirely false, but it is nowhere near the whole picture. The whole picture includes a boy who lost his brother before he was old enough to know how to grieve. It includes a man of faith who chose silence over performance even when performance was his survival. It includes a father who was present and devoted and terrified in all the ways that parents in pain are terrified. It includes an artist who never stopped making things even when the world stopped paying as much attention. And it includes a man who, when cancer took his voice, pressed his finger to the opening in his throat and kept talking anyway. You may be carrying something right now that you have not told anyone. A loss, a diagnosis, a secret, a grief that sits in you like a stone. And if you are, I want you to hear this. The people who survive these things, who come through them with something intact that matters, are not always the ones who fight the loudest or the most publicly. Sometimes they are the ones who go quiet and go deep and trust that there is something in them that knows how to endure. Val Kilmer pressed his finger to that tube in his throat, and he spoke, not to prove something, not for applause, but because speaking, creating, reaching toward another human being with something true, that is, in the end, what we are all here to do. The finger on the tube. That image will stay with you if you let it. An act so small and so enormous at the same time. A man making a bridge between breath and word, between surviving and living, between the version of himself the world knew and the one only he has always known. The question that remains, the one that this whole story keeps circling back to, is not whether Val Kilmer recovered. It is not whether he was difficult or extraordinary or both. The question is this: what are you willing to lose before you realize what you cannot afford to let go? What would it take for you to press your finger to whatever wound you are carrying and speak anyway? That is not a comfortable question. It was never meant to be.